Welcome, everybody, to Vegetable Pest and Disease Management. I am Dean Gunderson. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at Seed St. Louis. If you don't know about us, we're a nonprofit. It's been around for 42 years here in the St. Louis metro area, and we do lots of different things to help people who want to grow their own food. What we're most known for is our community and school garden program. We support about 250 different groups around the St. Louis metro to grow their own food in community. But we also offer lots of services for people who want to do that, including education, which is why you're here. So today we are talking about those pests and disease problems that you might be having in your vegetable garden, and we'll go through how to avoid them, how to manage them, how to deal with them if they get out of hand, all that fun stuff. So, there we go. So first, what is a pest? So just some general definitions of what we'll be talking about here tonight. So I define a pest as an organism that damages, stunts, or kills a desirable plant in this situation. So that organism could be a bird, it could be a mammal of some kind, it could be an insect, it could be a microorganism like a disease, a fungus, a bacteria, a virus. It could also be people, or more commonly, the tools those people wield. It could also be weeds, potentially. And sometimes what we consider a pest doesn't actually hurt the plant, but makes maybe the fruit less desirable, or the leaves look less desirable, or something like that. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well as we go through. But anything that kind of damages, stunts, or kills that plant that you don't want that to happen to. So how does a plant get pests? And again, this is, diseases, plant, all those things that we talked about, any of those things, how do they get them? So you need three specific factors, and you need all three of these factors for that problem to occur for your plant. You need a susceptible plant. You need a plant that is, susceptible to that fungus, that bacteria, that, is edible to that deer, or something like that. You need the pathogen, or the pest. You need the thing that's going to cause the problem. That also needs to be present, and you need the right environmental conditions. So if there's a fungal disease and it really only infects plants when it's 95 degrees, if it's not 95 degrees, you're not going to get that disease, even if the disease is around and the plant is susceptible to it. So you need all three of those things to happen. And the reason that is helpful to know is that means that all you got to do is break one of those. If you can make it so that you don't have one of those things, or you can modify one of those things so that it's not a factor, then you can avoid that problem. You don't need to deal with all three at the same time. So how do we manage pests? So this here is kind of the basic triangle of integrated pest management. And it kind of goes from, the base being the most important, and then you're kind of building on that. And so the idea there, and I kind of wrote these, this is kind of weird because the pyramid is the bottom. So we're going to talk from the bottom to the top, but then it's listed top to bottom because, So the base of your pyramid, the base of how you're going to deal with pests and disease, ideally is by preventing them, by, eliminating one of those three things. So that could be eliminating habitat for whatever that disease or pest is, so that you don't have that thing around. It can be proper watering, which changes the environmental conditions so that the plant is, not susceptible in that way. Or you can also have immune crops. Again, if you have a plant that is not susceptible to that pest or disease, then it doesn't matter if that pest and disease is around, because the plant isn't going to be bothered by it. So you can, start there. That's, like kind of your base. And then the next one up is cultural or sanitation. So this is things like cleaning up dropped fruit. So, like your tomatoes that are laying on the ground rotting are just spreading disease. So like just cleaning those up, cleaning up prunings, cleaning up diseased leaves and plants. And then things like intercropping and trellising. These are all kind of cultural practices that you can do that will prevent these issues. And then physical or mechanical. So this would be like physical barriers or mechanical things that you're doing to like block a pest or disease from accessing, or to remove them physically. So this would be things like row cover, hand picking, fencing, some stuff called humming line, which we'll talk about, netting, traps. Those are all kind of in the physical or mechanical level. So then, if you have those three things and those three things, are not enough, or kind of like the next kind of rung up the ladder that you move on to is biological. So this is things like encouraging predation through creating habitat and or introducing predators. So, and that could be a predatory insect, which is the one that gets talked about the most, or it could be a bacteria or a nematode or a fungus that is going to attack or destroy kind of the disease-causing thing that you're dealing with. And then kind of that last rung, if all of those things fail and you've still got issues, you can then use chemicals. And those don't necessarily have to be synthetic chemicals. They can be organic chemicals. They can be stuff from your food, from your kitchen sometimes. We'll talk about a few of those. But, something where you're like physically spraying or adding something that is killing or modifying or doing something like that to the organism or the plant to make it less susceptible to that issue or to kill that issue that you are having. So the first base here is prevention, like we talked about. So one of the things you can do for prevention is have resilient plants. If you are growing plants that are more heat and drought tolerant, as an example, they will be less stressed during our very hot and sometimes dry summers. And so if they are less stressed, they tend to be less susceptible to disease, just like every other organism. If you're super stressed, you're more likely to get sick. And it's the same with plants. If they are very stressed, they are more likely to get attacked by, a disease-causing organism. And some interesting research also suggests they're more likely to get attacked by insects as well. And so in the vegetable garden, what this often results to is kind of the most resilient plants we have tend to be the ones that aren't related to other things. They tend to have fewer pests. There's like fewer issues with those because there's not as many hosts for these pathogens, insects, things like that. And they're just not around as much. So some examples here of things that you might or might not have heard of that we like to grow here. So sweet potatoes, pretty easy to grow, just not really that many pests or diseases. Okra, same thing. Cowpeas or black-eyed peas is one type of cowpea, but there's like a broader range of things in the cowpea group. Malabar spinach, celosia, and amaranth are all summer leafy greens. So these pictures over here, the one on the left is, actually, I guess both of these are celosia. So this one here on the left is kind of the like younger leafy plant, and then this is once it starts to go to flower. You can still eat the leaves when it goes to flower, unlike a lot of other greens, and it will grow all summer and really has no pest or disease. And that's the same with amaranth, which looks kind of similar to this picture on the left, and Malabar spinach, which is more of a vining plant that you eat the leaves of. Also things like Armenian cucumbers, which are this is going to sound really weird, but it's actually a type of cantaloupe, but it looks and tastes like cucumbers. But because it is not a cucumber, it is not really susceptible to the same diseases or cucumber beetles. And so if you're having a lot of issues with cucumber beetles or mildew disease and things like that, Armenian cucumbers can be a great alternative. And then mouse melons. So another thing, if you like cucumbers and you have the same issue that everybody else has with cucumbers, which is fungal disease, mouse melons are another fun one where they are like a little tiny vine and they have fruit that are itty bitty, like little tiny things that look like watermelons. They look like little tiny watermelons, but you eat the whole thing and it tastes like a cucumber. But they don't really have mildew issues. There's not really any insect pests, and so you can pick just some of those. You can just kind of switch what crops you're growing. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So anything you can do for like weed avoidance. So, weeds are another pest that you have to deal with, another thing that can stunt or kill your plants that you want. And so this is one of the reasons why if I'm looking at varieties, I generally don't like to pick the shortest one or the slowest growing one. I like ones that grow fast and I like ones that grow tall because they tend to have fewer issues with weeds, because that's one of the reasons why weeds are a problem is they grow tall fast. And so they kind of shade out your vegetable crops. And so if you are picking vegetables that are themselves growing tall quickly, you tend to have fewer weeds. You don't tend to need to weed as often. You need to weed, when it's young, but then after that, once the plants get really tall, a lot of times they can kind of compete for themselves. And so picking those kind of taller varieties, faster growing varieties, which is generally listed as like a shorter days to maturity. You can also then have disease and pest resistant varieties. So we talked about, like Armenian cucumber is a different plant that you could grow instead of cucumber, but you can grow like squash. If you have issues with squash, there are just certain varieties of squash that are more disease and pest resistant. So these tend to be squash that are in the Moschata species. So there's several different species of squash. Most of the ones that are most commonly grown here in the United States are pepo species, and you don't need to necessarily know all the different names, but Moschata, a lot of seed catalogs now will list what species the squash is. If you look for Moschata, generally those tend to be better. The butternut is the most common one that people know that is a Moschata, but the two most disease and pest resistant ones that we found is for a winter squash. It's like a baking pumpkin is the Seminole pumpkin. It's unbelievably resistant to pests and diseases, and it also stores for an incredibly long time without any, refrigeration or special treatment or anything like that, just sitting in your house. And then Tromboncino, which is what this woman is holding here at one of our gardens, is a great alternative to zucchini. So it tastes, it's a summer squash. You harvest it when it's green like this. It tastes very similar to zucchini. The yields are remarkably high, and they are very pest and disease resistant. A little bit less than Seminole pumpkin, but not much. I mean, they're very pest and disease resistant. You can let them turn into a winter squash, but they're not very. I don't particularly like them. I think it's like a watery butternut squash. Like it's just not as good. But as a summer squash, they're really, really good. And then another one can just be like brassicas. If you have a lot of issues with cabbage worms, like the little green caterpillars, growing, cabbage or kale or collards or any of those that are red can be really helpful because you can then see those worms a lot easier. However, now that we have harlequin beetles really bad, which are those like red and orange kind of striped beetles that look kind of like fancy stink bugs, they are easier to see on the green ones than on the red ones. So it kind of depends on what pests you have. Another thing in the prevention range could be doing something like adding eggshells, crushed eggshells, to the bottom of the hole when you plant your tomatoes and peppers. So this would particularly be prevention for blossom end rot. So if you've ever grown tomatoes or peppers and you have that happen where the bottom of the fruit just kind of starts turning black and like kind of shrivels up and it looks like it's rotten from the bottom. So that's called blossom end rot. That's actually not an infection. It's a calcium deficiency. And so if you've had that issue in the past, just throw in some crushed eggshells in the bottom of the hole and then just sticking the plant right on top of those eggshells, you won't get blossom end rot. And so that's another kind of prevention thing you can do. So it's not necessarily a pest, but it looks like kind of has the same effect as a disease. And then some other prevention here would be watering is important. Everything needs water that we're growing. So watering frequency. So crops should be watered as often as needed, which I know is not a very helpful formula to tell you. But the thing that you're really checking for is anytime that the soil is dry, an inch down, you should water. And the reason that I can't give you a time is because, in my personal garden, that has varied between twice a year. Like literally I watered twice the whole year to several times a week. It entirely depends on the time of year. Like, how small is the plant? If the plant is really big and it's really hot, they're going to need water more often. If the plants are really tiny and it's cool, they don't need to be watered as often. Has it rained recently? How humid is it? So, it's been relatively hot, but the humidity has been insane the last couple days. And so stuff has not really been drying out that much. Things are drying out, but like not as much as you would expect for how hot it is and how much sun we have this time of year, because the humidity is just so high that stuff is not evaporating. And so it just entirely depends on the environment, the plant, how big the plant is. And so really the best thing is you just got to check your soil. And the best way that I always tell people is to kind of stick your finger in up to this kind of second knuckle on your first finger. And if your finger's dry, you need to water. If it's not dry, you could still water, but you don't need to until it's dry, at least that like inch, 2 inches down. It's also best to avoid watering the leaves if you can, if it works for you. Wet leaves can encourage foliar diseases. This is especially a problem on tomatoes. However, if you don't have an easy way to do that, or you have a giant garden and you can't like go with a little tiny, like with a little hose to each individual plant, that's fine. But that is where timing can then become really critical to helping prevent diseases. So if you're doing something like a soaker hose or drip irrigation or watering where you are not getting the leaves wet, evening is the best time to water your garden, because the plants then kind of have all, evening, night, early morning to kind of absorb that water, do their thing, kind of recuperate from the heat of the day before. But if you have to use like a hose or a sprinkler so that the leaves get wet, you don't want to water in the evening, because then those leaves are going to stay wet all night, and that is the perfect breeding situation for fungal diseases. So instead, if you are getting the leaves wet, you want to be doing that watering in the morning, so that they're getting the water like before the day starts to get really hot, but then the leaves are going to dry off relatively quickly, kind of as the sun comes up. However, all that being said, the best time to water your plants is whenever you can do it. Your plant is going to be more stressed and you are going to have more issues if you don't water them, if they need to be watered, than if you do it at technically the wrong time. So it is better to water at the wrong time than to not water if your plants need water. But ideally, those are the times that you're looking for. And then mulch. I kind of fit this into the prevention category, kind of in both directions, depending on who you talk to and what issues you're dealing with. So there is a debate among some people about whether you should mulch or shouldn't mulch, or what to mulch or what not to mulch. So I, for the most part, mulch everything, except I don't mulch squash. So squash bugs are very annoying and they can be pretty hard to control, and they do like mulch. And so I don't mulch my squash for that reason. And once the squash get going, they kind of are their own mulch. They kind of cover the soil on their own. But for pretty much everything else, I mulch. And mulch is just any dead plant material can be mulch. I like straw or leaves like that, fell from my trees in the fall. I save them and I put them on the garden. And mulch is going to do several things to reduce stress and improve the health of your plants, which again will reduce these pest and disease issues. So mulch will improve soil health in a myriad of ways. So it actually is adding nutrients as it breaks down, but it also improves habitat for things like worms, which are going to increase and distribute nutrients and beneficial bacteria throughout your soil. It also acts as food for like direct food for beneficial microorganisms in your soil. And most critically in the summer, it keeps the soil wet longer. So it helps maintain soil moisture so that your plants have water kind of as long as they need it. And it keeps the soil cooler. There's been some interesting studies that have been done more on large scale agriculture that have found that mulched soil is at least 10 to 12 degrees cooler than soil without any mulch. And I mean, that sounds like a lot, but it's actually a lot more than it sounds like air temperature wise. Soil temperature does not fluctuate anywhere near as quickly or as much as air temperature. And so keeping the soil 10 degrees cooler is a big drop. And it can really decrease the amount of stress on your plants. And the mulch itself can actually be a habitat for some beneficial insects. So it can be habitat for problematic pests like squash bugs and some other things. But it is also habitat for beetles, which actually eat weed seeds, and spiders love mulch. So if you don't like spiders, maybe you don't want mulch. But my areas that are mulched, I'm constantly finding spiders in there, which I love because the spiders are eating the bugs that want to eat my plants. And so it can be good and bad in both ways. It kind of just depends on what you're growing and what you're doing. So then the kind of next level up would be cultural control. So the first one is sanitation. So in the garden, you know, clean up your dropped fruit. So things like tomatoes, you know, and I feel like we've all been there. I am also not always 100% with this, but especially toward the end of the year, you get some tomatoes, they got overripe, they got rotten, they fall, they just sit there. But ideally, we really want to be picking those up and removing them from the space, because if they rotted, it probably means, you know, there's some rotting organisms in there that if you're just leaving them there, they can more easily kind of spread up to any other damaged fruit that you might have. Same with any dropped leaves, because those leaves, if they're dropped, probably had damage to them, which could have been a disease or could have insect eggs on them of a pest. So, like removing those. And then removing dead or diseased plants. So if you have, you know, your dead tomato plants that froze last fall, I mean, surely they're not still sitting in your garden, but just in general, when that happens, we want to remove those so that any, you know, pest insects, um, uh, pest diseases, things like that, that might be on that plant are not just going to sit there and hang out, kind of blowing around and colonizing the soil. And then you can also remove individual diseased leaves. So if you start seeing like, oh, there's some like blight or there's some issues on my tomato on a couple leaves, well, then just remove those leaves, just cut them off. Or the same like with squash, if you're getting mildew and it's just on a couple leaves, cut those leaves off and remove them. You don't want to just like leave them there because it can spread from that leaf to the healthy leaves. And then trellising can be a hugely beneficial thing, especially in our summers where we have lots of humidity. So trellising, getting things up off the ground, higher up into the air, and more kind of open, because they tend to be, you know, kind of relatively flat, kind of two-dimensional when you put them on a trellis, is going to increase airflow, which is going to reduce disease, because that increased airflow is going to dry those leaves more quickly. So in the garden, you know, you're going to use a trellis, and there's lots of different designs. These are, you know, this is a picture down here of like a cattle panel trellis. But you can also have, you know, just like a bamboo pole for beans to grow up, or you can have just like a post like you see here and tie tomatoes to that so that the tomato just kind of grows straight up. There's lots of different styles and designs of trellising, and whatever works for you logistically is fine. It's just about getting the plants up off the ground to increase that airflow. And some insects, like it actually can reduce some insect issues as well if it's up off the ground. And then intercropping. So this is the idea of kind of geographical diversity. So mixing things together. So some things that you can kind of plant together and why you might want to do it. So the onion family is really easy to intercrop with other stuff because onion family tends to grow very upright and skinny. And so you can just kind of plop them in all over the place. So the onion family, because of their strong smell, tends to repel various pests. Again, none of this is like assured. It's not like a magic thing that like if you put onions around your brassicas, none of the bugs will ever find it. Like that's not true. But it will help kind of reduce that incidence, lower the number of insects that show up, things like that. And so what you're really looking for, kind of like with the onions, is crops with different geographical needs. So you could think of, you know, like an onion, which has a very skinny, tall, upright, leafy part above the ground, but then below the ground is a big, wide, bulbous part. So it needs a lot of width in the ground, but not a lot above ground. Versus a cabbage has pretty tiny roots. Like they don't go real wide and they're not real big, but their tops are really wide and need a lot of space. And so planting like a row of cabbage and then a row of cabbage and then a row of onions, you're kind of complementing those while mixing them together. And then the smell of the onions helps protect the cabbage. And so you can do that. Or kind of the classic example is the Three Sisters garden, which is where you know, many indigenous populations across North America grew some combination of corn, beans, and squash, and many different people groups across North America had other plants integrated into that as well, but pretty much all of them had at least those three. And the idea being, you know, you'd grow the corn, the beans would grow up the corn. So the corn was basically the beans trellis. The beans would also kind of help. They would also kind of help stabilize the corn, which I I don't really know how to explain, but it does help a little bit. They long term can kind of help add nitrogen. They don't directly add nitrogen to the soil like in that moment, but they were kind of planting in the same hills over and over again. So like when those beans died, the roots rotted, they released nitrogen, and then the corn you planted next year would use that nitrogen. So you're doing it year after year, and you would get that. And then the squash would be grown in between these clumps. So the squash would then cover the soil surface, acting as a mulch. And the corn and the beans would cast some light shade on the squash, because squash, if it is not getting watered regularly, which it was not being watered when it was grown on acres by people who didn't have hoses or pumps or anything like that, at least on like a regular large scale, that shade actually helps them tolerate the summers. Squash need quite a bit of water, otherwise they start kind of wilting. If you've ever seen your squash in the heat of the day kind of droop over, that little bit of shade that the corn and the beans provided would prevent that. And so you can just kind of think of those like, well, what are the different kind of geographical layers? How might they fit together? And just try it. And a lot of times having those mixed together, again, also kind of confuses pests. It provides different habitats for beneficial insects, which are then going to help eat pests that might even be there. And it can just be a helpful thing to do. Another thing you can do, again, for dealing with weeds is dense planting. So a lot of times on seed packets, the spacing that is given is for like in-ground kind of like classic picture in your head of like a rural vegetable garden where you've got, like a row and then a big wide space so that you can walk down that row because it's a huge garden. You can't, reach from the end, everything in your garden. And so that spacing is often much wider than is needed for the in between the rows. But if you're growing in raised beds or berms or something like that, which is what most people are doing in urban environments where you don't need to walk into the garden, you can reach things from the edge. You don't need that big wide row. So you can often plant things quite a bit closer, at least the between row spacing. And what that does for weeds is they're going to shade the ground more quickly, like as they grow up, which is going to provide less time and less space for weeds to grow. And so you have less weed pressure that you have to deal with. Another thing you can do is kind of what I call season shifting. So this is one that we are liking more and more each year as our winters are becoming easier to grow in and our summers are becoming less enjoyable to grow in. So this involves finding varieties or entirely new crops that grow at a time that a pest or disease is less active or less damaging. So some examples of this would be not planting your squash until pretty late, like mid-June, late June. And you have to have the right squash to do that. You need one that is going to mature pretty quickly. But by that time, a lot of the worst of the squash vine borers have gone. There are still squash vine borers. You can still have problems, but delaying that planting can make it so that you have less issues. It's easier to control. It's easier to check on. So that's one way you just kind of like shift when you're doing it to kind of sidestep that problem. Or there are certain varieties of brassicas, particularly things like cauliflower and broccoli, which is what we see here. So this is the cauliflower. This is a sprouting broccoli where you plant them in the fall. They overwinter and then they produce very early in the spring. So they're really producing when there's just not harlequin bugs around, because harlequin bugs generally don't come out until it starts getting pretty hot. And so if you're growing those varieties instead of the ones that classically are not producing until it is already gotten hot, you just don't have to deal with the pests in that way. Also, overwintering crops tend to not have as many weeds because there's just not as many weeds growing. And the weeds that are growing in the winter are generally pretty easy to just rip out of the ground. They're not real hard or annoying. And you can accomplish this through season extension. We're not going to get into the details of season extension right now, but it's just, the idea of using things like cold frames or greenhouses or things like that to start things earlier or to keep things growing later, again, when there are just not pests out as much as they are during the normal season. So then we get into physical or mechanical. So this would be things like hand picking off bugs. So this, may not sound real appealing if you haven't done it before, but as you are a gardener longer and longer, You'll eventually get used to it. And for a lot of times, if you don't want to be using a lot of sprays or things like that, this is the simplest and fastest way to deal with insect problems. If it's not real out of control. If you go in and you see like, oh, there's a couple bugs here, a couple bugs there, and you know that they're problem bugs, just picking them off is a great way to do it. If it's something that can like fly, then unfortunately you need to kill that bug, or it's just going to fly right back. But if it's like a cabbage worm, oftentimes I just pick those up and just chuck them. They're not going to crawl all the way back. I have not had that. I have not had that happen before. As long as you don't just like drop them where you're at. And generally, the best way to deal with killing those insects is just if you have a little, a cup, a bucket, something that you fill up with water, and then add a little dish soap, and just you pick them off, you just throw them in there. And then if you have chickens or something, you can throw them to the chickens. The chickens will love them, or you can throw them in your compost, or you can just throw them on the ground and they'll rot and turn into fertilizer for your plants. For some small insects, things like aphids, generally the easiest thing is just to spray them with water. They're real tiny. If you knock them off the plant, they're not going to find their way back. They're too small. They're too slow. And so if you have a plant that's got a lot of aphids on it, you can just get your hose and just spray it, and all the aphids generally get kind of blasted off. And that's usually enough to deal with it. There's also kind of these mechanical methods of scaring things away. So there's this material here called humming line. So it's this just kind of blue plasticky thing. It kind of looks like cassette ribbon. Like when you hold it, it kind of feels like cassette ribbon a little bit. So what that is if you put in, two stakes or just tie it to two things taut, when the wind hits it, it kind of makes this like vibrating kind of humming noise that's a relatively low frequency. And for whatever reason, birds absolutely hate it. So if you're having issues with birds coming in and, pecking your tomatoes, or, I don't know what else you might have issues with birds in your vegetable garden. But if you do that, you kind of string that around or like over whatever the space that you are having problems with, they generally are not going to bother you. There's also some like older things that you could find for scaring birds, like hanging, CDs, and supposedly like the like flashing light as the sun hits it as it kind of spins around scares birds. Those do work, but a lot of times they tend to get used to it. They generally don't get used to this humming line for whatever reason. And then kind of the same thing, there's these things called bird eye balloons, or these big inflatable things that have these like look like giant eyes that kind of look like owl eyes. And a lot of times birds freak out and think it's a giant owl, and so they don't want to be around. But again, if it's like in the same spot all the time, eventually they'll tend to figure out, oh, that's not a bird. It hasn't moved in the last 6 weeks. And so it can lose its effectiveness, but if you move those things around, it can help make them last longer in their effectiveness. And then repellents. So there are lots of different recipes you can find online. There's things that people sell. They're supposed to repel or scare away things, like coyote urine is the kind of the classic one. Don't ask me how they get all this coyote urine. I don't know. But they sell it. And so that is supposedly pretty effective. The only thing I like to remind people about repellents, and this goes for the scaring things as well, but particularly the repellents for mammals, for things like rabbits, deer, raccoons, possums, things like that, is that in most of our urban and suburban areas, and increasingly in rural areas, these kind of historically prey species are just radically overpopulated, because we as a society do not want the predators of them around. We have mostly exterminated wolves. We have gotten rid of a lot of the coyotes, and we don't want any of them in our major cities. And so these, again, like particularly like deer and rabbits and things like that, there's too many of them because they don't have their natural predators, and there's just not as many hunters as there used to be. And so they're really hungry. And so there might be something that they don't like the taste of, and it might work for a while, but then it might stop working, because if they're hungry enough, it doesn't really matter if it tastes bad. And so what I often see with repellents, especially in these areas that have really high deer, rabbit, things like that populations, is that a repellent might work for a week, a month, a year, 2 years, and then just all of a sudden one day it doesn't work anymore. And it's not necessarily anything that you are changing. It's just kind of the calculus of the animals to some point. And so those are things that you can try, especially if it's kind of like a short-term problem, but they don't tend to work at a really long time frame in my experience. Slides like to be real slow. So also kind of in the physical or mechanical section are barriers. So this is what is kind of the gold standard for things. You could try repellent, might not work, but something that literally prevents the animal from getting to it is going to work. So for things like deer, rabbits, raccoons, a fence is really like what you need if you like want to make sure, or they're like a consistent problem that you're, the scaring or the, repellents or whatever aren't working for you. So how high the fence needs to be on deer, everyone will tell you so many different heights. It really honestly depends on how big of an area you're enclosing. If you're enclosing like 2 raised beds, the fence does not need to be that tall because the deer is not going to jump, into this little tiny space where it's going to run into the fence on the other side or something. But if you're fencing in like a large yard, then yes, it does need to be very tall because deer can jump very high fences, but they generally need, they need somewhere to land on the other side. And then they need to be able to jump back out or be able to feel comfortable to do that. And so you do need a relatively tall fence for a deer, no matter what. 3-foot fence is not going to keep out a deer. For things like rabbits, a 3-foot fence is fine, but the holes need to be pretty small. So in my experience, it needs to be like a chicken wire size, kind of that like hexagon of a chicken wire, that or smaller. I've seen even kind of that like hexagon, like 1-inch size, but it was like squared. And I sat there and watched a rabbit squeeze through that hole. It was a baby rabbit, but like I watched him just get through there and just start munching on stuff. But kind of that like chicken wire size or smaller is pretty effective at keeping rabbits out. You're not really going to have rabbits go through that, and it doesn't need to be super tall. Again, if you're fencing in a relatively small area. Raccoons are more tricky because they have little human hands, so they can climb pretty well. So the fence doesn't necessarily need to be crazy tall, but you do want relatively small holes, so because they can squeeze through larger holes. And actually, what I have found is less rigid fencing tends to be a little easier, a little more effective for raccoons, because raccoons are relatively heavy, and so they can't really climb up and over a chicken wire fence because it kind of flops and moves, and it's difficult for them. But it does need to be relatively tall, so they can't just kind of like step over or just kind of like climb over. Another thing you can try, though, especially if you just have like a raised bed, a couple raised beds, is kind of this idea where you see kind of a low tunnel where you have this hoop, and this is row cover. This is like to keep things warm. But you could do that, and you could put a mesh material. So this is insect netting, so that will help keep insects out. Or if you had like a more rigid mesh, like if you had like window screening or hardware cloth or chicken wire, that's another way that it would be like completely enclose kind of your plants to keep things like rabbits, raccoons, squirrels out. But it does need to be, completely enclosed in that way if it's going to be pretty short. For some things like squash or issues where you have vine borers that like bore into the vine, that's generally pretty low on the vine. So one thing you can do is actually just like wrap aluminum foil around the base so they just can't get into the vine. It can be pretty helpful. Bird netting exists. I don't usually like to recommend it, but in some situations, maybe it might be effective for you. Generally, what we like is insect netting more. Bird netting is cheaper and it comes in larger pieces, but the holes are big enough that if you leave it on there too long, the plant will start growing through it, which is then really difficult to get it off. And the holes are also large enough that some animals can get stuck in it. I had some kind of over vegetable plot, and I got sick. And then I was busy the week after that, catching up from being sick, and it rained that whole time and was hot and sunny. And so my plants grew through the net, couldn't get it off. And so I was like, oh, well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess I'm just going to leave it there. And then a couple weeks later, I came down and there was a garter snake like tangled all up in it, like was just completely caught. in this net because it's stretchy and the holes are relatively large. So I had to like do surgery to like remove this net, which I was effective. The snake is fine, but it was not fun, and sometimes you might not be able to get that animal out. So smaller hold things like this tend to be a safer option and are easier to reuse. Bird netting is really hard to reuse. You can also use fabrics, so like the insect netting, like we've talked about multiple times, or you could use row cover if it's a cooler time of year where having it a little warmer is also going to be helpful. So this is also going to keep things just a little warmer in there. And then you can also use things like crushed up eggshells and diatomaceous earth, which is just kind of a mineral product that you can buy. If you sprinkle a ring of those things around the base of the plant, this can deter pests that are crawling up the plant from the ground, particularly things like slugs, snails, and even rodents. So some other kind of physical barriers. So there's kaolin clay. So kaolin clay is a clay. It's very ultra fine and it's white. So what it is you actually put it in like a pump sprayer, like with water, and you like shake it up to make a slurry, and then you're spraying it onto your plants. So it's kind of like you're painting your plants with this, and then as it dries, it just leaves this very fine layer of white clay, and your plants look like this. It looks like something kind of spray painted them. This can be really helpful because that barrier of clay, like under a microscope, like you don't really feel it if you touch it, but it's pretty sharp. So if insects are kind of climbing over it, it kind of scratches them, agitates them, gets stuck in there, like in between their like the different joints of their body. They don't really like it, and then like to eat the plant, they have to like eat this sharp dirt to get to it, which is not real appetizing. The downsides of this are, one, it washes away with rain. It's clay. It doesn't wash away like immediately, but like you do have to reapply it several times throughout the year. And also, as you can see with this picture, as new leaves grow, they're not covered in it. And so you do need to reapply also as your plants are growing, if they're growing at the time that you're wanting that kaolin clay. But it is a pretty general kind of broad spectrum thing. It does kind of repel most things. So if you have an insect that's been difficult to control, this is something that you can try and is helpful for almost everything. It's not necessarily going to 100% fix everything, but it is helpful for a lot of different things. And then for physical and mechanical, we have traps. So traps are really nice. The main problem with traps is that there's not a lot of them that are effective for vegetable garden pests. So they are very low impact ways to kill insects because they are super selective. Like you can put one where there's insects all over the place, but it's only going to attract and kill like one specific insect or one specific family, kind of depending on what the trap lure is. So if they are available for your pest, they are really great. But most traps, unfortunately, are only effective for monitoring, not control. There's a lot of traps out there for certain pests, but then if you look at them, they're like, you really just put this out to see when the insect shows up so that you know when to start looking for it. They're not necessarily going to catch enough to like fully kill off a thing. One of the few exceptions to this, although this is, people get worked up about this statement, so let me finish it, is Japanese beetles. The Japanese beetle traps are super, super effective, but only if you do it in a specific way. So the like little tiny bags with a little yellow thing with a lure on the top and with that little like metal hook that you stick in your yard that they sell at most hardware stores, that does make it worse. That attracts, but does not necessarily get rid of Japanese beetles. The issue with that is a couple things. So Lincoln University, and I believe it was Kansas State, I can't remember, but I know Lincoln University did studies on mass trapping Japanese beetles, and they found ways to make it work. I got information then from our partners in Kansas City who were like, we learned it from Lincoln University. It worked really well for us. I've now been doing it for, I don't know, 5 years maybe. And it is magic. It is so effective. The trick to it is, one, you do not put it in the middle of your garden. because then you are just pulling things into your garden. You want to be putting these traps, multiple traps, around the perimeter of your space so that if there are Japanese beetles currently in your garden, they're going to be pulled away from your plants toward those traps. And if there's ones coming towards your garden, they're going to hit that trap before they get to your garden. So you want them around the perimeter of your space, not in your space. And then two, you want to make sure that the trap itself is never filling up. Because if the trap completely fills, then the Japanese beetle flies in, it lands, it falls in, but it's full. And so it can just climb right back out. And then it's not actually trapping, it's just attracting. And so what this often means, if you have a lot of Japanese beetles, is that you need a big container. Like I have seen ones where it is literally a trash can like this, and they put them out, and then they empty them once a year because that's enough to catch all of them for the year. But I'll say the first year that I did Japanese beetle trapping, I attached them to 4-gallon buckets, and I had to empty them about twice a week for the first year because they were filling up. Like I got literally probably 100 or more gallons of Japanese beetles the first year that I did it. But then the next year it was like half that. And then the year after that, it was half of that. And then the year after that, it was half of that. And I actually haven't had to do any trapping the last 2 to 3 years because the numbers are low enough that they have not been a big problem. But if you do it right, they are super effective. And we have blog posts that details, like with images, it has all that information, shows you how to make a trap, all those different things that you can find up on our website. For Japanese beetles, this is another one that is not necessarily like going to deal with everything, but we have had some luck with if you buy just like cheap yellow plastic plates from like the dollar store or something, it's that same color yellow as like the cucumber flower. And if you fill that with water and a little bit of dish soap and you put it like around your cucumber plants, especially before they start blooming, if the cucumber beetles that are around will fly to that thinking it's a flower and then drown. And then they're not going to be around to attack your cucumber beetles. So that can be pretty effective. And then beer is a pretty effective trap for slugs and snails. They like the smell of that kind of fermenty, yeasty smell. They climb into it and then they die because the alcohol kind of strips the mucus and dehydrates them. And so if you're having issues with those, you can kind of put little flat like saucers or like little disposable plates or things like that with just a little bit of beer in the bottom, and it'll attract them instead of them going to your plants. So then biological. So building a robust agroecosystem creates habitats for beneficial organisms. But this includes all those different things you see here. There's lots of different beneficial organisms, which we're going to talk about. So these organisms can outcompete, eat, parasitize, suppress, or create inhospitable habitats for pest organisms. So kind of your large allies. So these would be things like owls. So owls are actually really great to have around, as well as other birds of prey. But just as an example, there are plans online you can find to build barn owl boxes, like a birdhouse, but for an owl, which is really nice to have if you have issues with voles or field mice or things like that, because one barn owl eats 155 rodents a year. So if that barn owl is living in your yard, they're going to eat yours first. Or those rodents are going to be scared and they're not going to be hanging around your yard as much. You can also build perches, which are going to attract hawks and stuff to be sitting around there looking and doing hunting. Songbirds can also be really beneficial. They eat mostly caterpillars, not seeds, despite what I always thought. There was one study that found that putting bluebird boxes in a vineyard increased the bluebird population by 10 times. They didn't do anything else. They just put some birdhouses in there. And then they're eating caterpillars that are causing damage to their grapes or that are causing damage to your cabbage or things like that. Bats eat night-flying moths, and a lot of night-flying moths lay eggs that become caterpillars that eat your crops. So having bat boxes can be really helpful. And then if you're looking to plant some native trees in your yard, your garden, oaks, willows, poplars, and then prunus, so things like plums, cherries, things like that, support the most caterpillar species, which means there's then food to have these birds around so that they're also going to be eating the ones that are problems for you. And then having a water source. Everything needs water. And we have Again, a good blog post up on how you can make a really small water feature without having issues with mosquitoes while also growing some edible water chestnuts, if you want to check that one out. Oh, come on. So then your small allies. So this list here, which again, you can refer back to later if you need to, but pollinators, predatory insects, and parasitic insects, creating habitat for them. To do that, the best way is to aim for a continuous bloom. So having things blooming over as long a period as possible. Ideally native plants, just because they support the broadest range of beneficial insects. And then small flowers actually are usable by more, by a broader range. So this list here is one that we came up with, that it's like if you have these 10, it's kind of the smallest number we could think of where you get as long of a bloom as possible with the fewest number, that are also like small flowers and are useful for those different things. And then your micro allies. So we generally think of the micro world in terms of, bacteria, fungi, all those things as mostly the things causing the disease and the pest. But most microorganisms are actually neutral, and some are even beneficial. So microorganisms in the soil and on the leaf and stem tissue of your plant can actually make plants more healthy, more resistant, and less prone to infection and predation, believe it or not. And so these are some ways that you can support those beneficial microorganisms in your soil. So this would be things like avoiding tillage. So we do need to break up the soil sometimes, but tillers are kind of the most destructive to those microorganisms. So instead, using something like a broad fork, a digging fork, or just like a shovel to kind of break up your soil if you need to. Or if you are going to use a tiller, do kind of as shallow as possible so that you're not disturbing as much of the soil. You can also, I don't know why it says that. Yeah, this is a weird slide. Also, always have something growing. So this is where cover crops come in for vegetables. So having cover crops, or just, again, having mulch like we talked about earlier. That mulch can really help feed these beneficial organisms. And compost teas, or just applying the compost that you have made yourself, is a great way to introduce those beneficial organisms back into your soil. But even if you do all of those things, even if you do everything right, sometimes the pests still come. Just like even if you eat right and you're not stressed and you sleep and you do all these different things, sometimes you still get sick. So especially if you're wanting to use organic practices, it's really helpful to know what it is that you're dealing with. General sprays, things that you might see that just like controls all diseases, or just like orchard spray you'll see sometimes, generally can be unnecessary or even destructive. And it's also important to know that not all damage is a pest or disease. Sometimes it's caused by improper pollination or a nutrient deficiency, or like this picture here might look like damage, but it is damage, I guess, but it's a leaf cutter bee. It's a thing that's not going to come and kill your plant. It's a native. It's just getting a couple little leaves to make a nest, and then it's moving on. And often it can be hard to know what it is. You might think, oh, there's this terrible thing, but it's actually like two different things. So it can be really helpful to figure out what it is you're dealing with. And there's lots of ways to do that. You can check out things online. You can email us. You can ask your friends on, but also just observing the space. The last thing for biological, though, that's going to kind of move into our last section that I'm going to try and run through real quick here because I'm running short on time, is kind of introducing things like actively changing the system to kind of kill off something that is a problem. So you can kind of introduce biological things. So you can artificially introduce predatory or parasitic insects or nematodes. You can buy parasitic wasps in the mail, and then like put them out in your garden, and they'll fly out and parasitize and kill the bugs you don't want. This can be a helpful way to address an acute infestation, like, oh my gosh, this big thing showed up. I don't know what happened. I need to like get the population down quickly, or they're going to eat everything. So it can be really helpful to deal with situations like that. But those parasitic wasps, ladybugs, whatever you introduce, they're not going to stay there unless they have good habitat. They might be there for a little bit to eat those bugs, but then they're going to leave. And so you're going to be caught into this loop of having to just keep adding more and more every time you have a problem. if you don't do those things we talked about just a couple slides ago in terms of building habitat for them to then stay around and reproduce and hang out there so that they're around when you need them. And you can also use sprays to artificially boost the microbiome with select strains of beneficial microorganisms. So this one, Monterey Complete Disease Control, is a really good one that is, it's just like a really competitive bacteria that's not disease causing at all. And so it can be good to go on there, and then it's just hard for diseases to get established. So then chemical controls, our last, kind of the peak of the pyramid, the last resort here. So I just want to give, a couple things first here. So there are plenty of synthetic sides, herbicides, pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, different things like that out there that can knock back pests fast. That's not what we're talking about today. That's a whole other thing. But unfortunately, these also wipe out beneficial microorganisms, insects, and the real nasty ones can even wipe out things all the way up, to birds. There is even some evidence that they can disrupt protein synthesis in the plant, and this makes plants more susceptible to pests and diseases, thus requiring even more of those chemicals, which is a tough loop to get in. So therefore, we are talking mostly about relatively low impact organic options. However, synthetics can still be a potent tool that you might need sometime. So just like and everybody makes their own decisions, but sometimes that might be what you need. And maybe that's a decision you make, and you got to do what you got to do. Because I think it's also important to remember that, like anything else with side effects, it's a cost benefit analysis. It depends on what it is you're losing, what it is you're worried about, what it is you're trying to do. And if your options if all your other options have failed, and you might lose your entire crop to a pest, you have to kind of decide which is more important to you, not using that chemical or losing a crop. And it's also important to remember that organic doesn't inherently mean safe or non-toxic. Organic just means it comes from a plant or a mineral or a fungus or something like that. But there's a lot of really nasty stuff that comes from bacteria and fungus and plants. So just as an example, pyrethrins is an organic insecticide that's sold, and it's very effective because it's a neurotoxin, including a neurotoxin to people. And so it's pretty dangerous. Like, you need to be just as careful with it as any other, spray you're dealing with. Sulfur is really effective, but it's also a really fine powder when you get it, and it's highly acidic. So if you breathe it in, it's going to be a very bad day. If you get it in your eyes, it's going to be a very bad day. But it is organic. It's a natural mineral. It's a mineral that you need in your body, but not in the form that that it is there. So yeah, it's just important to know that you just kind of need to assess each one individually for, like, what's the safety. You need to read labels for any of these that we're going to go through to make sure that you're using whatever equipment is needed to be safe with them, and that you're going to be acting safely. Because even things that might seem organic and safe could still have dangers if they get in your eye, if you breathe them in, if you get them in your nose or in your mouth or something like that. So the first one for chemical control we'll talk about is horticultural oil. So this is a really light oil, like it's a really kind of low density oil that you use where you spray it onto a plant, and it kind of coats any like eggs or insects that might be on there, and they kind of suffocate for like small insects. It's not going to kill like a Japanese beetle or something, but like aphids or like little mites, little eggs, things like that. It's going to kind of coat them and suffocate them. It's most commonly known for fruit trees, but you can use it for really anything for the most part. You do want the horticultural oil, though, not dormant oil. So dormant oil is like an older product. It still exists. You don't want to use dormant oil on your vegetables, but horticultural oil you can use. Insecticidal soap is another one that a lot of people are familiar with. So this is not, you cannot make insecticidal soap, like true insecticidal soap, from like dish soap or something. This is like a different molecule that's in there. I think it's potassium or something like that. But it's very cheap. It's very easy to find. And it's another one that is really effective against small, soft-bodied insects. So this is not going to kill, again, Japanese beetles or stink bugs or harlequin beetles or anything like that. But it is very effective against these things you see here, like aphids, young scales, whiteflies, psyllids, mealybugs, spider mites. It does not work on caterpillars or beetles of any kind, and it must be sprayed on the pest to be effective. Another one is neem. So this is like the darling of the organic gardening movement. Neem is very helpful to have. The main way that I use neem now is if there's a problem and I can't figure out what it is, I spray neem on it, because neem kind of helps with everything, but I don't find that it really fixes anything if it's like a significant problem by the time that you're addressing it. But it can kind of slow it down. So I do always have neem on hand. I like it as a like, I don't know what this problem is. I spray it with neem to like give myself some more time. And then eventually I'm like, oh, it's this. And then I figure out like kind of the more specific, effective way to deal with that problem. Neem is also really effective as a deterrent. So I didn't talk about it earlier, but it can be an effective deterrent for certain things. Like if you have an insect that you know always shows up and deals with this, or is a problem for this plant, spraying neem before the insect shows up can be a pretty helpful way to have them not show up, or at least to have them show up in smaller numbers. And it can also be a preventative fungal, like fungicide. So again, like if you know you always have a fungal issue on a plant, spraying neem on it ahead of time can help prevent those fungal diseases from getting out of control. And you can see here from this list, neem is helpful for a lot of things here. But again, if your plants are getting totally shredded by harlequin beetles and you spray them with neem, the harlequin beetles ain't going anywhere. They're still going to eat your neem or your plants there. But it does kind of slow them down. They don't really like it. So it's effective as a preventative. It kind of slows down issues, and it can be effective for like lower numbers of pests. It is an oil. So like the horticultural oil, which we didn't really talk about, you don't want to spray anytime it's like really sunny and hot, because it can burn the leaves. So you want to do it either in like the evening, ideally the evening, or wait until a cooler time. Another one that's good to have is BT. So this is made from a bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis, that is toxic to Lepidopteran caterpillars only. So it's like a disease of Lepidopteran caterpillars, but it's not a disease of other insects or people or birds or anything like that. And the insect must ingest it. So you need to spray it on the plant, and then as they go around and they like are munching on the plant, they then get infected with this disease. They die. And it's pretty effective against things like cabbage worms, cabbage loopers, cutworms. It's theoretically helpful against squash vine borers, but it's not very effective. but it could theoretically help. People sometimes put it in like syringes and like inject it into the vine. So I mean, you could do that, but like spraying it on the plant is not going to prevent it. All right, we're getting close. Diatomaceous earth. So this is really more of a physical control because it's tiny rocks. Like if you look at it under a microscope, it's like little itty bitty sharp rocks. But it is like a really fine dust. So you do want to use eye protection and some sort of face mask. You don't want to be breathing it in. It's high in silica. It can damage your lungs. If you get it in your eye, it's again like tiny sharp rocks. And so you don't want that in your eye. But you're kind of spreading this over your plants. And then again, if insects kind of crawl on it, it cuts them up, it hurts them, it agitates them. They don't like it. So it's most effective against soft-bodied insects. It also just sticks to the bodies of insects because it's like a very dry, porous material. So it kind of sticks to them, which makes it harder for them to breathe, dehydrates them, makes it awkward to move. And so generally, if they land on a plant like that, they're like, man, I don't like this, and they kind of get off. So you just sprinkle that on dry. And yeah, it's particularly helpful for caterpillars and other soft-bodied insects and small, hard-bodied insects. So I do really like it for like flea beetles on eggplants. It's not super effective on like larger, hard-bodied insects like harlequin bugs or stink bugs or things like that. But they don't enjoy it. So like you could still add it. And again, kind of as like a preventative or a repellent or something like that, it is somewhat helpful for those larger insects as well. And then lastly, for these is the broad spectrums. So these are things that will kill everything, just like kind of, people imagine like a synthetic insecticide. There are organic broad spectrum insecticides. And these should really kind of be your spray of last resort because they will kill, all the beneficial insects too. These are, however, the only sprays that will kill beetles. So again, they're the only things that will kill your Japanese beetles, your squash bugs, your harlequin beetles, those like larger problematic insects. These are the only organic options that will kill them. So the main two is there is spinosad or spinosad or spinosad. I've heard various different pronunciations of it. So this is from a bacteria that was originally found in a rum barrel. It's pretty effective, and you need to be careful with it, but it's less toxic than pyrethrins, but it is more expensive and it is a little harder to find. Monterey Garden Insect Spray is just one name brand, but the active ingredient you're looking for is this spinosad. And then there's pyrethrins, which is an extract from the chrysanthemum flower. So it's just like, an extract of a flower. It affects the nervous system of pests. On people, it can cause skin irritation, and absolutely do not ingest it. Follow all the safety labels on all of these things that we're talking about. And then lastly, we have fungicides. So the organic options for fungicides are basically copper, sulfur, whey or dairy, which I'll explain real quick, and neem. So all of these are most effective as preventative, especially dairy and neem. So when I'm talking about dairy, this is the way, so animal dairy, so not like oat milk is not going to do anything. So animal dairy has something in it that when it's exposed to the ultraviolet radiation of the sun, it releases free radicals that are really toxic to fungal spores. And so it is really effective as a preventative fungicide. My preferred way to do it is just buy like a container of like powdered milk, or if you've got like powdered whey sitting around, and it's 2 tablespoons of powdered milk or powdered whey per gallon of water, and you dissolve it and you spray it on your plants. And you want to do it when it's sunny, because again, it's the sun interacting with it that actually has the fungicidal properties. And it's pretty effective, but again, mostly as a preventative. Sulfur and copper do have some effect on active fungal infections, but again, are most effective as preventatives. The other thing that I have had some people have some luck with, I have not experimented with it a whole lot because I've been super lucky and not had a lot of fungal issues where I'm at, mostly because my garden is incredibly windy, which has its own problems, is vinegar spray. So if you mix like 2 parts water to 1 part normal white vinegar, and do not do any higher on the vinegar or it will burn your plants, and then spray it on your plants, this can be pretty effective as a fungicide because fungus are mostly pretty sensitive to pH, and vinegar is very acidic. So changing that pH regularly by spraying it, and then it kind of dries off and the pH goes back, and then you spray it and it then dries off and kind of goes back to its pH. That kind of back and forth can really disrupt and kill off fungus. So there we are. Sorry I went a little long. It's a big topic, but I am happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. I'm gonna